Good afternoon, YouTube. My name's Daith, and today I think we're going to go over the 13 primes from Transformers. So, the concept of the 13 is roughly a little old, little new. So, the original concept kind of started out as basically a fan thing, or, well, originally kind of more Simon Furman's pet project, you could say. Furman, most of you who's in the Transformers would know is a longtime comic writer for the series, from all the way back to G1 up until, at least IDW. I don't know if he's done anything recently, but anyways, Furman originally crafted a story about a group he would call the Zodiac originally. And, kind of ancient Transformers, powerful ones that, were behind the scenes. The first of them, eventually would be introduced during his G2 run, but we're going to go in order more by the more modern aligned continuity, which is kind of what Hasbro's doing these days, as have basically they've adopted the concept as their own and as the 13 primes. You know, we've seen this in, I would say the first, to actually mention it in continuity would have been, Transformers Prime itself, despite, various members appearing beforehand. The, let's see, I would say I'm bad at this, can you tell? Editing is not my strong suit either, so I feel sorry for you all. So, but, so after Transformers Prime, or in the making of Prime, they adopted the concept of the 13, which had already been established thanks to the Transformers Collector Club years prior, in which I believe Simon Furman also had a hand in, introducing that. So, anyways, let's actually go and start this by going through and going prime by prime here. Starting with the first, Prima. This is the first the first robot that Primus, the god, the planet Cybertron itself, you know, would end up creating from itself. He's the first one. He's, the stoic white knight, the, law rule giver, the lawgiver, and he is the first wielder of what would be known as the Star Saber, his personal sword, which, if you can see in the artwork here, actually has the matrix of leadership in the hilt. So this is the one from the artwork from the Covenant of Primus attached to the Transformers Prime here. So this, however, would be the first time, this is all the way back in G1 here. He was never given a name here, but this was like one of the original Autobots in the past, or at least one of the original robots that rose up. And I can't remember if this is them rising up against the Decepticons or the Quintessons in this, but essentially he was one of the first Autobot leaders. So, and since, we're going into Age of the Primes here, here's a look at what we're actually getting for Prima. So, as you can see, we got kind of a nice, matrix with the blade, with the Star Saber blade. And since he's never really gotten his own like alt mode, they've kind of adapted him into some sort of like truck rover, lunar rover type of thing with a hover mode included. So he's kind of been, one of those ones where he's been in the background of, how many series, but he's never got a starring role. The best you could say is, reading the Covenant of Primus, which is a good read. I have a copy myself, and even though a lot of the later parts of just it's just kind of running through the beats of the Transformers Prime series, as a fun look at the history of Cybertron. Anyways, going on. The second of the primes is actually my favorite of one of my favorite bots of all time in the Transformers series. This is Vector Prime, originally introduced in the Transformers Cybertron series, which this is where his look from that right here. Love him. He is the basically the Transformers guardian of space and time. Essentially, they're Doctor Who. They're uh, you know I wouldn't say Doctor Strange because he's not really magic so much, but essentially, he's the one who's basically there to keep you know time itself going. And right off the bat, love the knight look he's got. The clockwork the clockwork knight has always been, kind of my favorite thing about him. The big shoulder pauldrons, the wings turning into a kind of a cape behind him. And the fun part is, they had fun, making his head sculpt basically the Autobot symbol. So, anyways, so as we go on, oh, well, I guess let me actually go back and show off that yes, he is one of my favorites. And oh, I meant to do this earlier, but all the primes eventually got like one figure, at least one, or one toy you could say, during the previous Power of the Primes line, which was their Prime Core Spark. Which, okay, this was Prima. That's the little symbol they gave him there. And let me go ahead and go into Vector Prime here. If it goes into focus at all. So, and each of the primes will have their own symbol going forward. So, anyways, back to what's on the screen now. Here we have probably the most well known of the primes in a way, outside of another, I would say, Alpha Trion, the original old bot from Generation 1, the creator of Optimus Prime and Elita 1, and basically the knowledgeable, old man, the Obi-Wan of the series. So here we are, this version of him, well known, he's had quite a few. He's actually one of the few that's had, I would say, at least a good handful of toys at this point now. It took him a while, but by probably the mid 2000, well, mid 2010s, he started getting toy after toy, whether or not it was an actual Transformer or like a little Creo minifigure. I got one right here, just off screen here. Sorry. Like one of the latest ones was one of the convention, exclusive packs, and it's basically a nice little retool of what is it, Studio Series or one of the generation Scourges. So of course he actually turns into like the little space boat thing too. Though interestingly enough, Tryon has actually had like another alt mode that's kind of persisted over the years, and which, let's see, is the okay. Well, first off, here's the align continuity Covenant of Primus look for him, which, and I meant to go over this. I know the Star Saber. I already went over the Star Saber with Prima, but each of the primes have their own in the Align continuity. They were gifted their own artifact of power of sort. So, like I said, Prime had the Star Saber, kind of also had the Matrix at the time, but Vector Prime had his Blades of Time, which not necessarily his sword, but it's they call it a mandala or mandala. I can't remember how you pronounce it, but that would be his way of cutting through space and time to travel to where he needs to be. So, in the aligned continuity here, Alpha Trion has he is the basically chronicler of the Covenant of Primus itself, which is the book in his hand and the quill to write in it. Which in before the first time we saw the Covenant of Primus, it was just basically kind of as a funny joke to in Beast Wars near the end of the series, both Primal and Megatron found a copy, and it was just kind of like a book on tape. But in this, the Covenant is an actual tome that Tryon writes in with the quill there, and interestingly enough, though, he has the power to alter probability, you could say, by writing in the in the Covenant with the quill. Not like complete control, but he can alter events if need be. Going on though, let me get back to the other alt mode that he's more famous for these days, which going into Transformers One is the like lion like mode, which actually was first done well first brought up an idea by the Transformers Collectors Club, who wanted to retool or recolor a Beast Machine Snarl lion figure into a nice purple shaded Alpha Trion. And actually, the Collectors Club would be the first one to actually get a Alpha Trion figure out, even though it wasn't that one. It would be like it was actually funnily enough, it was a recolor of the Cybertron Vector Prime toy, which I know I showed off the other one. You might be able to see the original Cybertron one up above me. I don't know if it's showing up in the shot or not. One of my favorites. So, anyways, going on. So we've gone through Alphatron. Now, probably one of the more important in the more recent fictions. So here is Solus Prime. She, that's the big thing right there. She was one the only basically female coded of the 13, and thus why, and their lame excuse for why there's so few female Transformers in the franchise, but we all know that's just because the old folks in charge just thought oh, girls won't sell to the boys, yada yada. Well, girls will sell to the girls. Get the girls into it. Just because it's a transforming robot series doesn't mean there aren't girls interested. Shocker. So, anyways, this is from the Covenant of Primus artwork again. So, as you can see in her hand, she's holding part of her artifact, the Forge of Solus Prime, where, well, yeah, the Forge hammer, which, well, let's see. Do I have it? Okay, well, going into the next shot, this is how she looked in the Power of the Primes machinima cartoon. Kind of, kind of what her new toy will be modeled after in the Age of the Primes toy line coming up. So, but here we have here's a good shot of the Forge and the Creation Lathe, a holographic matrix that, basically she is able to create whatever she wants within her own, sense, if she can imagine it, she can create it type of thing. So the Forge is the hammer that, basically, makes wills it into being, whereas the Creation Lathe is, her way of visualizing it as she works on it. And the Forge was heavily used in the Transformers Prime series. There we have Transformers Prime Bulkhead wielding it as eventually it just became like the favorite bludgeoning hammer of the series. Though it was in during the part of the series, it was used, I believe, twice to create. First off, interestingly enough, later on we'll get into a bit of this, but the creation powers were only supposed to be used by a prime themselves. Megatron found a way around that, and I'll get into that with one of the later primes here. But he used it to end up creating a dark saber, a dark energon infused version of the Star Saber. And then later on, in a moment of near death for Optimus, it basically used its last energies of creation to reformat him into a larger, more stronger version of himself. So, onward. Here we have Micronus Prime. This is, again, the Covenant of Primus version. And in this, he is basically the progenitor of any sort of mini bot in the franchise these days. So you call it, even though I know other continuities have like their own origins for the Micromasters or say Minicons, you know, in the current setup of the mythos, Micronus is the progenitor of all the micro transformers. So going on, it's like his artifact in the series is the Chimera Stone, which in a way is basically their way of explaining the way minicons would power up other larger transformers. They would be able it allowed him to share his own energy with the other primes to empower them further. So, though they have actually used him in interesting ways in the franchise since. Namely, here we have him in Transformers Robots in Disguise 2015. And in this, he was almost, you could say, Optimus's Obi-Wan, or, Yoda, more actually, the small, wise master for him to train under. So he basically became, the one to like guide Optimus in the afterlife, you could say, and like empower him so when he actually came back to life later on in the series that he would be ready for what was to come. More on that later. And then IDW, they didn't quite do the same thing as the 13, and there it was for them the 13 were all just ancient tribe leaders. They weren't necessarily the first Transformers, but they were the ones that, brought together the tribes at first. But Micronus, interestingly enough, has ties to the greater IDW Hasbroverse, you could say, as he is actually the creator of the Microverse, or the universe of the Micronauts in IDW. I'm not too well versed in that, but I mean, that's alone kind of an interesting thing. Each They kind of like had a fun time trying to tie in all the different Hasbro series in IDW later in the later part of it. Going on, here we have Alchemist Prime, and you could say he's the most friendly of the Transformers. He, his artifact was the lenses, which was I can't trying to remember how exact. Basically, it allowed him, greater sight, beyond sight, going Thundercats a little there. But essentially, it would help him see past the, physical realms into, essentially more mystical or, greater, sight that, most wouldn't be able to see. But going by his name Alchemist, he also later on, once the Primes decided to blend into history, or after the greater conflict we'll get into here when we get into some of the later ones, he basically he was actually hinted at before the 13 concept got into greater being in the Transformers Ultimate Guidebook, also kind of written by Simon Furman, and he was essentially created to be, or rumored to be, MacAdam. a basically barkeep of like the local Energon watering hole, the most popular place to just, chill out and, Cybertron, which Cyberverse ran with. And here's McAdam there, which, yes, they did end up, revealing later on that, yes, he was Alchemist Prime, which, fun. I've been forgetting the Prime Spark skin, haven't I? Okay, anyways. So here I have them right in front of me here to show off. And, anyways. So rewind a bit. Okay, go back here. So here's Alpha Trion symbol. It's kind of a like group of diamonds in a way. Solus Prime kind of has her like forge hammer as her symbol, knocking down Vector. Micronus has his little M that you actually kind of saw in the Covenant of Primus artwork. And now that we've caught up, Alchemist Prime Spark, which I don't know what you're supposed to make out of that. It's kind of like just kind of an ink blot test to me. Okay. Anyways, back to this. I'll have to remind myself not to skip the next, few. So, and okay, going back to this, Cyberverse, he was a fun character. Even in this, when they showed the Transformers at McAdam's place, there was a strict no fighting rule. Autobot, Decepticon, it didn't matter. You could have Prime and Optimus in the same room, and if McAdam was there, they knew not to friggin' mess with him. You never actually saw what he transformed into, but the one time where he like showed the shadow of what it was, you could see, they were afraid of it. Okay, here's the fun one. So, let alone, yes, this is Nexus Prime, the combiner of the primes. And his first appearance here was in the Transformers Collectors Club fiction, as they used old molds, the combining molds from the Energon series, to basically recolor them and make their own like build a bot, build a bot combiner out of for their like first few years of exclusive figures mailaways or so to entice people to join the collectors club. Never got me. It was a little too expensive for my taste at the time, and even now, it's like considering those molds, they can have it. It's nice that they're all in the red and blue, but I had the original Energon ones. Those weren't great toys. I ended up giving them away to my nephews eventually. Anyways, onward. So, and his yeah, his artifact is the Enigma of Combination. You did get a look at it in the Combiner War series. They kind of made it this weird, like trapezoidal, like matrix-like item. But anyways, it allows basically the bonds between different transformers to create combiners. The interesting part about Nexus though is even though he had like individual like well, okay, the original version of Nexus and the Collectors Club, they were all individual boss that would eventually recombine into him. Whereas, let's go on to the Covenant of Primus version. They never really indicated that any of the bots had personalities solely separately, but they were all capable of doing things separately once they were disengaged from the whole. So interesting that thought that. But we're kind of wondering how they're going to do this in Age of the Primes, whether or not it's going to be, or is it going to be just kind of this thing where like they get the aerial bots and, maybe, since they are mix and matchable with like the Stunticons, perhaps maybe like, will we get like some like fan mode where it's Nexus, or are we going to get an actual like retooled set of combiners in a gift set or something? We don't know yet. Stay tuned. here we have probably one of my other favorite ideas in here. This is Onyx Prime. And it's not exactly apparent the artwork has never been this great from the Covenant of Primus, but he's rearing up on his hind legs here. So yeah, there's it doesn't quite look right. It's hard to tell, but he's got his front legs, kind of like horse rearing up where he's so here you can tell he's a well, if you can make it out, he's kind of a combination centaur type of being with wings. So we don't know if he has like this is the only thing we've kind of seen him in artwork as. I think one had Transformers one had him in a more solid bot mode, but um, this we don't know exactly what his alt mode is. So this, once they do, we've seen artwork for Age of the Primes come across now, and it's similar to this. So we don't know what they're planning for his, alternate mode or not. Actually, I should mention in the Covenant of Primus, the original Primes weren't necessarily Transformers. We'll get into that here in actually a Prime or two, anyways. Anyways, Onyx Primal, and I skipped the Prime Spark for Nexus, didn't I? I'm sorry. I'm not good at this. I'm not good with editing, but okay. There's the symbol for Nexus. You can kind of see where, it's all kind of like the combining around the initial, middle diamond there. We'll go ahead and get into Onyx before I forget. Not really, intuitive as to what the symbol's supposed to be. It looks just kind of like a carapace, a shield, or surrounded by fire. Though his spark core was a little tougher to get as it was included only with the Titan Predaking figure, and is usually settled in the figure, sandwiched into a matrix of leadership kind of harness, you could say. The fun part of that, Power of the Primes line was like a lot of the leader class had like a matrix of leadership, and you could pop out the core and use any of the Prime Sparks cores in it. So, anyways, back to Onyx. Or well, that might be about all I can really say with Onyx, other than his artifact, the Triptych Mask, which I'm not exactly remembering exactly what it did. I believe it was kind of similar to Alchemist's lenses, as it was something that was used to basically, in a way, I would, if you've seen Beast Wars, how the protoform pods would scan for life forms. His mask eventually did that for Transformers life on Cybertron after his death, you could say. So we'll get into that in a few more. I know I'm pushing it off here, but we're gonna get into that once we hit the big ones. Okay, so here's what you can try and make out as Amalgamus Prime, the ever shifting Transformer, the original Transformer, you could say. He was the Cybertron, the first Prime that was able to shift between forms, you could say. And his artifact of was a power was the T cog, the transformation cog. After, once, man, I'm pushing this off, but again with Onyx Prime's Triptych Mask and the T cog was given to Cybertron to create the Transformers race eventually, based. Thus, every Transformer should have a T cog afterwards. And the funny part is this kind of doesn't mesh well with the Transformers 1 movie, even though he's in there and looking a little bit more like a little stout eh, little monocular robot thing. Sorry, had a hard time thinking of what to describe him with. I didn't pull up the picture for that one here. Probably should have. He does Amalgamus doesn't have much in the way of artwork these days, but so anyways, so he was kind of like you could say somewhat of a fun prankster of the group eventually, but him and Micronus were always kind of the ones, hanging out and, chilling. Onyx, a lot of the middle ones were close to each other from what the Covenant of Primus says. So, anyways, well, not a whole lot going on with him. Let's make sure I get the spark core this time before I go to the next guy. Again, not really, another one of those symbols where it's not really readily apparent of what it's supposed to be. A lot of them really aren't, I'll admit. So, anyways, going on. Quintus Prime. Quintus is going to be one of those ones where it's interesting how things play out depending on which series we go with. Here in the Covenant of Primus, he is like a life giver. He wants to make new forms of life for himself, and see how they affect the world around him. This is actually one of the things that ends up creating the big rifts in the original 13 eventually. Him, along with some of the later primes that we'll get into, began creating new forms of life before Transformers on Cybertron that weren't exactly safe, you could say. And this is what, Prima ended up getting a little on his case along with some of the later ones here and created the first rift between the 13. So eventually, though, in the Chronicles of Primus, he's the creator. After he leaves Cybertron, he is the creator of the Quintessons. Thus, Quintus Prime. Though, in more recent times, here is Quintus Prime from the Earthspark cartoon. So, ugh, oh crud, what is it? Trying to remember the artifact's name. Essentially, uh, kick my ass for this later, but he has a stone of his own that basically is capable of creating new life. Essentially, the Allspark in a way, just not the Allspark in other continuities. So, but in Earthspark, he was a very large proponent since this artifact is what helped create a new, I would say, I don't know if I would call it race or just a new breed of Transformers on Earth, the Terrans. So the Terrans, were, I mean, they were Cybertronic life forms, but they were of Earth. Not the first thing in the franchise, true, but this was, kind of a new thing for this version of the franchise. So it we haven't seen quite the end of Earthspark yet, from what I understand, but there should be some way of basically there one of the big conflicts has been the quintessons coming to take back what they feel is theirs, and then the terrans themselves as new life forms. It's been an interesting thing, not a bit, I know, controversial for some things that I could care less about. The whole series has been pretty decent overall, but anyways, Quintus Prime, here's his Titan Spark. Kind of a odd, it has kind of buggish, not exactly showing up too well in this, but buggish look to it, you could say. Okay, next up. So, probably one of the other oldest versions, and probably one of Furman's first hints at the what? Well, this dates before his concept of the Zodiac or the 13, really, but I would say the first concepts of it growing here. This is Liege Maximo. Basically, this right here on here is the end of the G2 Generation 2 comic book that he, finished off. Later on, he would expand on this to create the Zodiac concept, but here he kind of made him like what basically I think Unicron would fill later on, but like the emergence of, all evil for Cybertron. But in later ways, this isn't quite where they ran with it. And you'll see with his later incarnations where they might be going here. What's this remind you of if you're familiar with the MCU or Marvel in general? Yes, he's Transformers Loki. So in the Covenant, yes, he's the trickster, the manipulator. He's, the guy, creating the problems, yet not being the main problem himself. So, yeah. And he was one of the ones with Quintus that, created these other, beings on, that led to the, fighting in between themselves. So, according to the Covenant of Primus, his artifacts are the Legion darts. Basically, just toxic darts, designed to poison and incapacitate. I'm not great with speaking at times. So, and going on, IDW would actually, use him in an interesting way too. Here's his, form from there, still similar to the Loki design. I forgot about saying something about Onyx with this, but I would say IDW's Onyx is a bit on the weird side. So in this, he emerged and, well, yes, he was kind of the manipulator. He was also one of the ones that kind of tipped off that, Onyx Prime in IDW wasn't really Onyx Prime. Yeah, that's another story in itself, but spoilers, Onyx Prime was a time traveled shockwave that went to the past and manipulated events from there onward, creating a nice little bestial transformer army for himself later. But that's another story. Let's keep going here. So, anyways, Transformers Loki. And this would be the Prime Spark symbol that they gave him. Moving on. And here we have the most famous of the 13, I would say, these days. One, he's been renamed since to be the progenitor of, well, going by Transformers 1, D16's, adoptive name, Megatronus Prime. But here is the first appearance as the Fallen. So, and he's had different kind of, again, he's been in multiple things over the years. This is his first appearance in the Dreamwave comics, where it was hinted that he was corrupted by Unicron, which even in the Covenant of Primus with that version, yes, they admit that he is one of the ones that would be more like Unicron in destructiveness. And here in like the Dreamwave comics, he always had a fiery aura around him. So skipped ahead a little bit. Here's his Age of the Primes toy coming up. Probably should have done that with some of the others, like Soulless, but as you can see, they're still going with this War Within, Dreamwave look with the fire effects all over him. And might as well go into it. His artifact, which I should note, all the artifacts in the Covenant of Primus, the Aligned Timeline, Transformers Prime, etc., they were all created by Solus Prime. And here we have the Requiem Blaster. So it's basically the most powerful cannon created, basically, at the time. Basically. So, of course, the sad part is once the primes began to fight between each other, the biggest inciting moment was even though Megatronus was very much in love with Solus Prime, in a moment of anger, he used the Requiem blaster that she created herself to kill her, and thus incited the events of basically the whole primes fighting between each other. But going onward, this is probably what most people know the Fallen from, and that is Revenge of the Fallen, the Bayverse film, which it's interesting how they use them, kind of similar as, one of the original Primes type of thing. The kind of like this, and here's something that kind of started with this is like his face was the original Decepticon look, supposedly, for the sigil. Not true for the franchise overall. Most would consider that being Soundwave, I believe. But here, this is where they tried to, this look of the head with like what I would say almost a pharaoh like, look with it. Of course, going back to Egypt with that, in the movie. But they've used the Fallen or Megatronus quite a few times since too. So here is the Covenant of Primus look for him. This is, the Align Prime continuity, what was in the book. Again, the Requiem blaster on his arm. Kind of not quite, fully going with the Decepticon look, but you can definitely tell the head crest is trying to, equate that. And later on, Megatronus or the Fallen himself would actually reappear in the actual cartoons in the Prime sequel series, Robots in the Skies 2015. And whereas the Covenant would, try and say he left to repent, not so much in the cartoon. Basically comes in as like one of the main antagonists or the end bosses of one of the seasons. Eventually, where Optimus Prime had to come back from the afterlife to fight him. But his latest incarnation in Transformers 1, definitely still the, facial, design that, inspired the Decepticon logo, but here we don't really get anything from that. All we know from him in Transformers 1 was that he was supposedly the strongest of the primes, which, yes, was still kind of his thing. Anyways, well, that was kind of, the, impetuous, his whole look, being the Decepticon, inspiration. They didn't quite go with that with his Prime Spark. Yeah, I don't know what they were really doing. Anyways, and that's 12 of the 13. Now, in Transformers 1, they went a little bit differently, but in the Covenant of Primus and other sources, it's been up in the air who the 13th has been. But since we're going with, what they're planning on doing in Age of the Primes, and what Hasbro's kind of, done since then following with the Covenant of Primus for the most part, we have 13. And 13 was the eternal optimist. I think you can tell where we're going here. So 13 was the youngest, obviously, the 13th created, and he was a friend to all. He was, willing to get along with anybody, try and create peace between all, always trying to, mediate between the older and the youngers. He, I don't think they ever gave him a actual artifact of his own in the Covenant, as he was essentially, let's not beat around the bush, it's Optimus Prime. So Optimus was the 13th Prime in the Covenant of Primus. So, but where this basically, the divide between, what we normally know as Optimus and his original form is that he loses. So after the War of the Primes, basically, where they all fought and, killed some of each other and, the others would go on, Optimus would willingly sacrifice himself as he was as in his like 13th demigod like state, and in helping to create the Transformers race by igniting the well of all sparks, as they would come to call it, he would himself take the dead body of Onyx Prime along with his artifact, the Triptych Mask, and Micronus himself would also, willingly, hop in with them unknowingly to the others. But the three of them would basically trigger the Well of All Sparks to essentially, create the first generation and all generations to come of Transformers life on Cybertron from Primus. In doing so, he reincarnates as later on as Orion Pax with no memory of who he used to be. And okay, I know I got it here. I had added the picture just in case, but his Prime Spark, the nothing to really say that the 13th, but that's what they gave him. So in the age of the Primes Toyline, they're basically using in Japanese continuity, this would be the furthest evolution of Optimus Prime once he revised for like the third time or something like that. Star Convoy or Star Optimus Prime, as they're calling him in the States. Personally, I still like the Star Convoy better. It sounds a little bit better than just adding Star to Optimus Prime. So in here you see the up in the corner there. There's an artifact with like the 13th symbol on it. It's supposed to represent something called the Zodiac from a Transformers series in Japan, which was another thing which was supposed to be kind of like, if I remember right, it was like the basis of all life in the universe, supposedly. Yeah, anyways, we'll go on that. So, but some have theorized that this is supposed to essentially be Optimus regaining his demigod like status by, up, his like final upgrade, you could say. So, anyways, and like I said, Transformers 1 went off and did it a little bit differently. The 13th Prime there, which, and also the leader there, was Zeta Prime, which has been another like Prime that's been used off and on in different continuities. Like, actually, in the Prime continuity, he wasn't part of the 13, but there was a Sentinel Zeta Prime that was Prime before Optimus, that led Cybertron and was eventually killed by Megatron. So, anyways, I'm getting a little long in the tooth here. I'm not sure how well this is going to do with everybody, but that was the 13. I guess I forgot to mention the whole reason Primus created them in the beginning was the fact that it was like the eternal stalemate between him and Unicron, and like the 13 were created to like shake things up, and the 13 before their war ended up fighting off Unicron and reverting him into his planet form in a dormant state at the time, according to the Covenant of Primus. Anyways, let's end the video here. I'm a little long in the tooth here. I'm sorry for the disorganized part. I'm still new to this. Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.